All right. Thanks everybody for joining us. This is Eric Hauge with Homeline, and you are joining us here at Homeline's weekly webinar. It is Wednesday, September 9th at 1:30 p.m. and you're joining us for our weekly webinar on COVID-19 and pandemic-related tenant landlord issues. And this week we are going to discuss the most recent CDC federal eviction suspension that was announced and went into effect last week. And also we'll be having a guest speaker, Dan Hilton from Housing Link, discuss some rental market trends that they're seeing in the midst of the pandemic. Just a reminder that what Homeline is, we're a statewide nonprofit organization. Our main program is a free and confidential legal hotline that any renter can contact in Minnesota in up to 4 languages: English, Spanish, Somali, and Hmong. And we have been doing these webinars since about mid-April. Thanks for joining us again today. As always, we are going to record the seminar today and post it on our website. And on our website, there's also information about previously recorded seminars, and we have FAQs on some of the more common topics that we hear questions about on these webinars, as well as on our hotline regarding pandemic-related housing issues, rental housing issues. And just one last note is that we are going to, we'll provide the slides also when we post the recording, because Dan has shared quite a bit of information and slides with this week's seminar. But again, we are going to kick it off with Homeline's managing attorney, Mike Vraw, going through just a brief update about where we're at in Minnesota as far as eviction suspension, the legal, logistical aspects of it, and sort of how that corresponds to the federal moratorium that was just announced last week and went into effect on Friday. As always, you are welcome to submit questions. We did get a few in advance through registrations, but you're welcome to submit your questions via the chat or the Q&A system over Zoom. And we're going to save time at the end for questions, both about logistical legal issues related to the eviction suspension and other things on that, as well as if there's any questions for Dan at Housing Link following his presentation. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Homeline's managing attorney, Mike Vraw, to briefly cover some of these topics.
Thanks, Eric. And just to be clear, we're leaving all the questions for the end of the session is the plan for today. Let's start by talking about the brief overview of the eviction situation here in Minnesota. Those of you that have been following along on a weekly basis or checked in once a month or something like that, or if this is the first time you've joined us, you're welcome to, or thanks for coming by. But how I've always sort of talked about the eviction ability of landlords in Minnesota is thinking about hurdles that they have to get past in order to be able to file an eviction. Since March of this year, COVID-19 hitting, that's when we started to see these hurdles pop up that we've never seen before, where landlords couldn't file an eviction legally, an eviction, unlawful detainer, UD, all being the same thing. So right now, here are the 3 hurdles that I think that a landlord has to be able to file an eviction that we know about currently. Number 1, the Minnesota moratorium. This is a governor's executive order tied moratorium, which is tied in time to the peacetime emergency declaration by the governor, ends officially on September 11th, which is 2 days from now. It has been renewed by the governor for 5 times already. It looks likely that it will be renewed again based on information given to the press and the fact that the legislature is gearing up for yet another special session on Friday, which is an automatic occurrence if the governor extends the peacetime emergency another 30 days. The governor can only do 30-day increments at a time. That's all they're allowed to do. And so that's what we expect to happen on Friday. That hurdle remains in place. And that is the first hurdle a landlord has to get past in order to file an eviction in Minnesota. Is it allowed under the state moratorium? There are exceptions, and we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about those exceptions today. But keep in mind the biggest reason why landlords file evictions, non-payment of rent. A landlord is not allowed to file an eviction for that reason currently. Well over 90% of evictions in Minnesota filed for that reason generally. And that remains in effect. We expect it to be renewed for another 30 days. We won't know officially till Friday when it's announced. But that moratorium is the first hurdle that a landlord would have to get past in order to be able to file a non-payment of rent eviction. Hurdle number 2 is the CARES Act, which is a federal law that was passed in March, again, responding to COVID-19. And it had a deadline or a sunset provision in it of July 25th. However, after July 25th, the landlord is still, if they're covered by the CARES Act, required to give a 30-day notice before they can file an eviction. So if you got a landlord that thinks they're covered by the CARES Act and the Minnesota moratorium disappears on Friday, for instance, then the first question a landlord would have to ask is, are they covered by the CARES Act? But the latest hurdle, and this is hurdle number 3 for a landlord to be able to file an eviction, is a new federal prohibition that went into effect on last Friday, the 5th or 4th or something like that. And it was issued by the CDC, Center for Disease Control. What that has to do specifically with housing is something we'll talk about a little bit, but that's where the order came from, and it's a new federal prohibition. Go ahead and roll the slide, Eric. So what does this ban, again, officially went into effect September 4th, that goes through the end of December, the end of the calendar year. I mentioned earlier that the governor's moratorium on evictions went in 30-day increments. That's all it's allowed to do under the law that gives the governor peacetime emergency powers. This law says all the way through December 31, a landlord cannot file an eviction for non-payment of rent. It's a very limited list. It's pretty much the one item that a landlord can't file an eviction for. The rent is still due. Just like in Minnesota, the executive orders from the governor have always said that rent is still due. A difference from the CARES Act is under the CDC order, late fees are allowed. They were not allowed under the CARES Act. And the CARES Act, again, covered any landlord that had federal subsidy, any landlord that had a federally backed mortgage like Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac. But here's the most important takeaway for a Minnesota landlord. The CDC order only applies in states where there's no eviction moratorium already there, or if it's weak, a weak eviction moratorium. And Minnesota's is much stronger than the CDC. It has more expansive protection for tenants. So I'm gonna fill in some more of the details about the CDC order. Right now, it's somewhat meaningless in Minnesota. If the governor's order, eviction moratorium gets lifted on Friday or next month or the month after that, then this will matter a lot. But I'm going to give you some of the highlights of the CDC order. I should mention this. When the executive order from President Trump was issued in early August, we actually went point by point through what the executive order actually granted. And it didn't do much realistically. There wasn't much meat there. The executive order from the president. But one of the things that the president did do in the executive order was he ordered the CDC to consider options for delaying or stopping evictions. And I guess this is what this resulted in, is the CDC ordering a federal ban on evictions. And we'll talk about the legitimacy of this order when I'm almost done. But we'll go through some of the sort of logistics of how the CDC order actually is supposed to apply. Go ahead and roll the slide. Thanks. First of all, it's most tenants. It applies to most tenants. There's no federal subsidy requirement. It doesn't have to be the CARES Act qualifiers, right, where we had, again, a federal subsidy or Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac backing the mortgage. This is any tenant, so it's much broader. Any United States renter, residential renter, earning under $99,000 or roughly $200,000 for a couple, estimating their income for 2020. So that's a lot of tenants that we're talking about that are protected under this CDC order. The tenant does have to do something, though. They're not simply automatically protected. They have to provide a statement under penalty of perjury that somehow their inability to pay rent is COVID related. So they lost their job because of COVID, or they have medical bills or something like that. They also have to state that they've tried to get whatever assistance might be out there, including government assistance, that they're trying to make partial payments if they're possible. And that an eviction would likely mean that the tenant ends up homeless or doubled up as a result of the eviction. So the tenant does have to take an affirmative step. Now, we have been asked about this quite a bit since the CDC order went into place. We have seen tenants actually provide the written statement to their landlord complying with the CDC order here in Minnesota. I don't think it really hurts a tenant to do that. I don't think it really helps them to do that currently. But that's what's required. There are, first of all, a lot of states where there is no eviction protection right now, other than the CDC order. So this does stop evictions happening in several states around the country, whether they either never had an eviction moratorium or it's been lifted recently. So this is a meaningful order. It's not like the CDC order doesn't mean anything. It just doesn't really mean much in Minnesota today. But anyhow, the tenant has to give this statement swearing that effectively they don't have the money to pay their rent, their income qualifies for the CDC order, and that they've done what they can to try to pay what they could. Okay, go ahead to the next slide. So, is this constitutional? Well, a group of North Carolina landlords filed the first case that I'm aware of today, or maybe in the last couple of days, challenging the CDC order. Again, it didn't take any legal effect until Friday. It was actually announced last Tuesday, but it didn't become official until Friday. So I put a quote here. You can find lots of quotes, lots of people cheering this on, this order from the CDC, a lot of people railing against it dramatically. So there aren't actually too many people that are truly, completely thrilled about the CDC order. Tenant advocates in general are saying, okay, that's nice that it's stopping evictions for a while, but what we really need is funds to go ultimately to the landlords through the tenants, or directly to the landlords or whatever, to pay the rent. Because if we stop evictions through December 31, what's going to happen is on January 1, you're just going to open the floodgates then when it's really cold out in half the country. So is that really what you want to do? Landlord groups and a lot of right-wing thinkers think that this is completely unconstitutional. And we have a quote from a Kentucky United States representative, a Republican, who's saying that this is possibly the most socialist action our government has taken in decades. And knowing a little bit about Representative Massey, that's quite a statement, because he thinks a lot of things are socialist actions on our government's part. So he thinks this is a big deal. He's not the only one. I'll tell you a couple of the theories that have floated around. Is this a taking, sort of an eminent domain, the government swooping in and grabbing property being rent / the actual rental property from a landlord? Is that an argument that a landlord would have in a lawsuit? This is a private contract that state law historically controls. Those of you that have watched me for a while know that I talk frequently about how most landlord-tenant law is state-specific, and in our state, it's becoming city-specific in many cases, where cities are stepping in and saying, we want to enact more tenant protections. But here, the federal government is just swooping in saying, we're going to stop all evictions from happening, more or less, for non-payment of rent. The CDC's power is inherently drawn from a federal statute. The CDC does have some statutory power, and by that I mean Congress passed it and the president signed it at some point in the past. But the rule where they talk about the CDC's broad powers refers to some examples, which are getting rid of insects or vermin, especially if there's a concern about them going from one state to another. And that's the law that they're building this federal eviction ban on. I don't really know how firm that ground is. I don't think anybody knows how firm that ground is until we see some court, not challenges, but court decisions on the case. I can tell you, having read the CDC order several times now, because I tried to make sense of it. We had another attorney in our office spend a lot of time digging into it as well. It is not a conventional piece of legislation. Well, it's not legislation at all. It's just a direct order. But it's not conventional at all. It's a very, well, it's not hard to read. There's no legal flowery language. The problem with it is it's not really enumerated. So it's sort of I can't remember how many pages it is, 37, I want to say, sort of stream of consciousness thought where they'll talk about the pandemic itself, and then they'll talk about evictions, and then they'll say, here are some thoughts that we have, and then it'll say a part of the order, but it's not enumerated anywhere. So normally, if I'm telling somebody how to find a statute or an order, I'll give them a citation. With this order, the only way to really cite effectively, you can't say number 2, subdivision 3A. You can't say that. It just doesn't really read that way. You'd have to say page 14, halfway down the page in the second paragraph. It feels incredibly sloppy to me, the whole CDC order, like it was drafted sort of a first draft that I'm not sure how much it got edited. It's not like there's typos and the words are wrong. It's just not especially well thought through. But anyhow, it does seem to attempt to stop evictions from happening throughout the United States through the end of the calendar year. So that's a dramatic move. It's much more expansive than the CARES Act was. It's limited in time, obviously, so it's only going through the December 31, but it adds protection in any state where, or city, because a city ordinance or a county ordinance could also be protecting a tenant more, where there's not protection for tenants to have evictions filed against them right now. So we've essentially gone from, I think, well over 24 states that evictions were able to be filed in as of a week and a half ago to now none of the states, at least for non-payment of rent. So it is a massive change. We expect multiple challenges, probably at different federal courts. And if there's not a consistent ruling on that, I would assume that the Supreme Court, or certainly the Court of Appeals, the Federal Court of Appeals might take it up. And then the Supreme Court might even take it up if there's conflicts between federal circuits. So it's a stay tuned kind of thing. The penalty, by the way, massive against landlords for filing an eviction in violation of this order, $100,000 and up to a year in prison. The Department of Justice has the enforcement power on this. Just to compare that, in Minnesota, if a landlord files an eviction improperly, it's a misdemeanor up to $1,000 and 90 days in jail. So quite a bit more prohibitive the federal law is, the CDC order. So that is the brief summary of the CDC order that I promised. I'm going to turn it over to Dan, and then we'll open it up for whatever questions you might have the rest of the day. I guess I'll let Eric introduce Dan and his topic as well. Thanks for joining us, Dan.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. And just a reminder, we will answer if there's any questions about the CDC moratorium, but for the most part, I mean, the important thing I think Mike mentioned to note right now is that effectively it's not really that relevant in Minnesota, except for the fact that it does extend till the end of the year. So if there's questions, feel free to submit them. We'll get to them at the end here. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dan Hilton, the research manager from Housing Link. I think a lot of folks know Housing Link for their housing search tool, data, research, education resources. And so we want to thank Dan for joining us today. He's going to run through sort of some of the aspects that they're seeing in terms of the rental market due to the pandemic in the Twin Cities. And so we really appreciate you being on, Dan. And Dan, I think, shares, or maybe much more than me, shares a love of trail running like I do. So if you want to talk about trail running at the end too, I mean, if there's questions about that, you can add. So thanks, Dan. I'll let you hand it over to you, and let me know if I'm messing up the prompting the slides.
Sure. It's a little cold and rainy for trail running today. I can report that. And I'm going to go ahead and go no video here. There's an unacceptable amount of activity going on in my house right now. I have 2 school-age kids and 3 pets that are kind of just about and creating a low level of havoc. And this is one of the first times I've done a presentation like this, so forgive me. But we'll go ahead and start up the first slide there. Eric, thanks. So I'm, as Eric said, I'm research manager with Housing Link, Dan Hilton. Housing Link, if you don't know, it's a Minneapolis-based nonprofit with a mission of improving people's lives through information expanding their affordable rental choices. So the vast majority of people who know of and encounter Housing Link do so by virtue of resources we provide for low to moderate income renters and case managers who serve them. We get 30 to 40,000 visitors a month to our website, where we have a housing search tool with affordable rental vacancies, as well as waiting list openings for subsidized housing. And we also have a bunch of resources, housing tips, training videos, that sort of thing that help folks navigate the very complex world of affordable housing. So that's how the majority of folks know us, but we're also engaged in research on rental housing market trends and supply. And a lot of our work is driven by two proprietary data sets. Next slide. So our Streams database is a publicly accessible database of all rental properties and units in the state of Minnesota that are contractually obligated to a level of affordability. In this tool, you can search by a number of parameters related to funding source, expiration date for the affordability restriction, location, and so on, either by map or by city or county name. And then you can click through to see details on individual properties, or even export the results of your search to a CSV. And that is a public free tool available to anyone on housinglink.org/streams. You see the link at the bottom of the slide. Next slide. And the other flagship data set from Housing Link is our rental review data. So for about a decade, Housing Link has published our quarterly Twin Cities rental review report. We have year-over-year figures on rent by number of bedrooms and building type. That is multifamily apartments versus the shadow market of single-family, duplex, condo, and townhome rentals. Our data is somewhat unique in the industry, as a lot of data that's out there is based on surveys of occupied units. But those surveys are usually going through large management companies and don't really provide insight into what's going on in the shadow market. As you can see in this report right here, if you look in that chart in the lower left, the shadow market currently only comprises about 23% of the vacancies that we encounter. So multifamily apartments are 77% as of our most recent report. That's currently, but in the Great Recession, about half of the vacancies we saw were in the shadow market. The percentage is much smaller now, but it's not insignificant. We think it's important to include the shadow market. Say like a single family or duplex rental it's more likely to be like a mom and pop type operation, and a lot of landlords of that type are maybe a little more easily able to work with a renter's unique and sometimes more challenging circumstances. And in some submarkets, there's just an outright lack of large multifamily stock. So a single family or duplex rental might represent a family's only opportunity to move into their child's school district or close to an employer. So we just think it's important to reflect the entire scope of rental options that are out there for renters when we do our research. And that's actually one other thing I should mention about our rent data is where a lot of information on rent trending comes from surveys of occupied units. Our data comes directly from publicly advertised rental listings. So if there's a unit that's been occupied for a number of years, whether the rent is going up or staying the same, we're not going to pick that up. We are going to capture it when the renter moves out and the landlord makes a decision on what to list it at. So as a result, we tend to be very responsive to changes in the market and capture a lot of new construction and new units that are hitting the market. What we like to say is that we're reflecting literally what a renter is seeing in the open market. So we've published this Twin Cities rental review report for almost a decade with quarterly year-over-year updates by submarket. And we can go ahead and go to that next slide. A couple of years ago, we decided to dive a little deeper into Minneapolis and St. Paul, where our sample sizes are a little larger, and we began publishing monthly rental housing briefs. So in these reports, again, for Minneapolis and St. Paul, we're looking at year-over-year trends still, but publishing a new report every month. And in these, we can dig a little deeper beyond rent amounts and say, like, what does that translate to in terms of affordability? So looking at the percent of units that are affordable to families at varying levels of income, or giving the total number of listings we saw for a given month that were affordable to families making 60% of area median. So basically, what I've been talking about are a few of the Housing Link resources from where a lot of data that I'll be talking about comes, and then those are being regularly updated, so you can always check those out on our website. So the data, what does it tell us? Well, it's nice to have data about what has happened and is currently happening, because what is going to happen is kind of crazy town right now in terms of speculation. There's really no analogous period in the history of our economy where the various factors in play right now were all coming together before. One narrative that's out there right now is that rents are dropping because of COVID. Next slide. Here you see just a few headlines that imply a direct connection between COVID-19 and falling rents. And I can't speak to every market in the US. Certainly you hear stories about renters just flat out leaving New York City when cases were spiking this spring and the resulting vacancies having an impact on the market. But I can tell you that here in the Twin Cities, we were seeing some evidence of a housing market that had peaked in terms of rent prior to the pandemic. Next slide. Here you see average rents in the Twin Cities. We're looking at the fourth quarter calendar year, so rents from October to December of each year, pretty much from the end of the Great Recession to the end of 2019. And you're seeing a pretty steady climb. There's a small dip in all 3-bedroom classes from 2013 to 2014. And then again for 1-bedrooms in 2016, 2017. But overall, it's a pretty steady trend line up for all 3 of the bedroom sizes, but definitely down from 2018 to 2019. And that trend did continue again when we looked year over year from Q1 2019 to Q1 2020. So we were starting to see those rents head down. And there are a few other indications from our data that suggest a softening of the market that preceded kind of the full-blown pandemic. Next slide, please. Here we see some figures drawn from actual visits to housinglink.org. Now, as I mentioned, the majority of people visiting our website are there for housing searches. And you see that in that same Q4 period, the 2018 to 2019 searches for affordable housing on Housing Link were down 25% from the year over year. And at that same time, listings are up 15%. So vacancy postings are up 15%. So more vacancies being listed, fewer people looking. Now this is only on a Housing Link site, but it is, many thousands of searches and thousands of listings. And listings are not the same thing as vacancy rate, but they're highly related. Certainly we typically see changes in vacancies that are posted to our site follow vacancy trends. And you might say, oh, Housing Link is getting less popular. People aren't visiting Housing Link. Next slide. We see that, in fact, visits for Housing Link research resources are up 44% year over year. So people can't get enough of that good Housing Link research. Next slide, please. But I'd say don't take only the Housing Link data word for it. Marquette Advisors, which surveys 10+ unit multifamily properties in the metro, is showing vacancy rates above 3% for the first time in nearly a decade. For context, a 5% vacancy rate is generally regarded as a healthy rental market. So all this to say, the preceding slides, that before we're prepared to say that there's a direct impact on the market from the coronavirus pandemic, it's important to acknowledge a number of indicators that were already in play heading into all this. And in fact, that is something that we were thinking about, that the year-over-year trends weren't particularly helpful in us trying to discern what's happening in real time. Next slide, please. So the combination of having monthly data available to us and wanting to look for more immediate changes led us to launch a resource called the COVID-19 Rental Housing Trends Dashboard. Another resource that's available from our website, and this is one of my first personal forays into Tableau. So it's sort of this is just a slide, but if it was a live web view, it's one of those Tableau sort of interactive visualizations, and you can go through a number of different tabs in the visualization to see some different metrics. A lot of them are drawn from the metrics that were used in our rental housing trends report. If you recall, the reports that were specific to Minneapolis and St. Paul. But in the case of those, we were looking, their monthly reports looking at the previous year, and here we're looking month over month since the beginning of 2020. And so basically we can sort of see where the onset of the pandemic was and see if we can see any sort of change that's notable. As you can see, rents as of July, which is the most recent month for which we have data, are maybe a little down at the metro level from the beginning of the year, but nothing that we wouldn't have expected to see as part of a longer general downward trend on rents. Now, this is at a metro level, and very often submarkets behave independently. Next slide. We know that a lot of rent growth in recent years was driven by new apartment construction in and near downtown Minneapolis. So just as one example, here we're looking at one-bedroom apartments over that same time period, January to, oh, I thought July, but it looks like I just have June there in the chart. But you see that sort of modest decline for the Twin Cities as a whole, but steeper in downtown Minneapolis. We do know that even as the market began to soften a bit, a lot of projects for development were still in the pipeline for downtown. So that Q2 report from Marquette Advisors reported the highest vacancy rates in the metro right there in downtown Minneapolis. So if you think about higher, a number of units that are continuing to come online, even as rents are heading down, and then a higher vacancy rate there in the metro, it's just sort of all those factors coming together. And everything I'm suggesting so far is that a lot of overall market trends we're seeing are as a result of factors that were in play or trending prior to the onset of the pandemic. So what is the impact? What has it been, and what is it likely to be? As I said, there's not really an analogous situation to look back on. I do think there could end up being a large impact on rents and vacancy from the pandemic, but it's really going to be a lot more of a lagging indicator. Right now, there's a few artificial constraints on the market that are slowing down the processes. I know that Homeline's ongoing webinar series has been talking about a lot of those constraints, but that's more from like what's, from an individual, how does it impacting individuals? And I'll try to talk a little bit about how that is impacting how we see it in data. Next slide, please.
Quick question, Dan.
Yeah.
Just to clarify, when you use the phrase either metro area or Twin Cities with your data, is that specifically 7-county metro or? Yes.
Yeah, that's, and I think that's for most research that is done locally. Yeah, 7-county metro is what we're referring to.
Okay, thanks.
Sure. So here, the Minnesota Multi-Housing Association has been surveying their members throughout the pandemic, collecting rent payment information on about 30,000 units in 3 apartment classes. And what they've been finding out thus far is that largely renters are staying current. On-time rent payments as a percent of all tenants have dropped a little since the beginning of the pandemic, but not a lot. And the numbers are only slightly below the same month last year. But something doesn't seem to add up. We know the pandemic has disproportionately impacted lower income families, both in terms of people contracting the virus, but also in terms of job loss. Next slide, please. Urban Institute estimates 87,502 low-income jobs lost as a direct result of the coronavirus recession. These are jobs in hospitality, food service, healthcare, frontline workers, retail, so on. Next slide. Although we don't really need to see this, intuitively we know that low-income families are disproportionately represented among the ranks of rental households, but this slide really bears it out, where only 18% of owner families in the Twin Cities are making less than $45,000 for a household, where 53% of the rental families. So these are lower income families that are experiencing job loss, and an awful lot of them are renting. Yet we saw just a couple of slides ago that 88% of renters, even in Class C apartments, were current on their rent as of August. So what's going on? We were wondering that too. We had suspicions that, the CARES Act had passed back in March, which included both the $1,200 stimulus checks and the enhanced federal unemployment. But we wanted to find out just how critical that assistance had been, especially for lower income families. And also, since the stimulus check was a one-time shot and the unemployment assistance was going to run out, it has run out, but this is back in June, we conducted a survey of renters who have an account with HousingLink. Now, for any of you who wish to use HousingLink to search for a home or want to refer somebody on to us, it's not necessary to sign up with HousingLink in order to use our service. It's free for renters, free for landlords. But if you do, you can set up a profile to get alerts sent to you by text or email if new listings come up, new listings come online that match your whatever you're searching for. So a little plug there, but it's by virtue of having those emails that we can reach out to renters for surveys like this. So in June, we surveyed the renters to try to get a sense of really a number of things going on under the surface of these mostly on-time rent payments. Did you experience job loss or loss of hours? And if so, how critical has the federal assistance been in helping you stay current? And then, do you have reason to expect to be back to full employment at the end of July when the boost runs out, and how might that impact your ability to pay rent going forward? And I'll start by saying that we survey our renter base once a year, and pretty consistently we find that over 90% of our renters have household incomes of less than $45,000, which is kind of in line with that recent, or that stat I showed you a couple slides ago, although we're definitely representing a lower income group of renters. We didn't ask about income specifically for this survey, but we use the same method for polling potential respondents, which is to look at anyone who identified as a renter and has been active on our site in the past year, who has conducted a housing search on our site in the past year. Next slide, please. So of this group, 91% say that they were current on their rent as of the beginning of the pandemic. I have it in smaller type there, but one really important piece of context, and something that gets a little lost when talking about rent payment and assistance and so on. For this question, were you able to pay your rent? We gave people 2 options for yes. The first was, yes, I could generally stay on top of rent and my other bills. And the second was, I generally stay current on my rent, but often am unable to pay other bills. You will often hear the term cost burdened used in this industry, referring to households that are paying more than 30% of their income for housing. It's useful for analysis, but really abstract in terms of trying to understand what that really means to a family. In many cases, what being cost burden means is paying your housing payment at the expense of other bills. And when you think about it and see, like figures about job loss and uncertainty about the future in the following slides, it's just some context to keep in mind about how close to the edge a lot of these folks are on a regular basis. So 90% of folks current heading into the pandemic, although for 44% of them, not even always able to pay other bills. And then that 91% was down to 72% by June. So you could think, well, that stimulus check was good for one or maybe 1.5 housing payments, but maybe not all of it even went to housing. Maybe it didn't go past a month. So next slide. So on job loss, this is just startling. 70% of our respondents had lost their job or had their hours reduced as a result of the pandemic. You can see figures below it that speak to what they expected their situation to be as of July 31, and there was not a lot of certainty. Next slide. This next one is one that we really wanted to get out at specifically for those who had remained current thus far. How important has the stimulus check or unemployment assistance been in that? Flat out, 35% could not have paid their rent without it. And remember, just because you can pay your rent doesn't mean everything is cool. 53% of those who could have, who are or would have been able to stay current would not have been able to do it, without having to fudge a little bit on other bills. Next slide. So finally, what's the implication of this? How do things look for you without additional federal assistance? 26% of people said they would not be able to continue to pay rent into August. Next slide. It's past August. It's September 9. The U.S. Senate adjourned in mid-August, having not come to any agreement over a second stimulus package. So whatever uncertainties people had over what was ahead without additional federal assistance has, for the most part, played out with some caveats. Next slide, please. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the protections and mitigations. There are a number of different sort of a patchwork that has come about over the past month and a half that is somewhat mitigating the impact of folks falling farther and farther behind. We'll take a minute and run through that. Next slide, please. So Homeline covered the eviction moratorium subject, and they said a quick overview, but it seemed pretty in depth to me. So I won't go into how it works, but in terms of its impact on the market. Next slide. Here's a graph I got from the Hennepin County evictions dashboard. I was going to put a URL at the bottom of the screen, but it's one of those URLs that would take like 3 carriage returns to fit on there. And I think it's easier to just Google Hennepin County's evictions in Hennepin County data dashboard. And it follows a number of different trends, geographic looks, and so on of what's happening in Hennepin County with evictions. And you see here a very clear illustration of what happened after the moratorium went into effect in March. And I think, and this is said, I believe, I'm often here for the Homeline presentations. I think it's said week after week. And it's important to keep in mind that moratoriums are not an exemption from paying rent. So rent will continue to accrue and will be due as of the end of the moratorium period. It's sort of like, you know, in the cartoon where somebody closes off the end of the hose and the bubble of water continues to grow. That's happening right now. And this graph here is just for Hennepin County. It's, you know, the largest county population wise by far, but it's just one county in the state. The moratorium is buying time, but it's not digging people out from under. Thus far, the only thing that we know that will have a direct impact on whether people can ultimately stay in their homes is any sort of direct impact on their finances. So that's either reemployment or, you know, being fully employed or federal assistance. But for now, people can stay in their homes regardless of whether they can stay current. Next slide. As an aside, in terms of impact on the marketplace, it has been suggested that the vacancy rate is artificially low due to lack of evictions. I think it's worth considering how we've seen that families in Class C units and lower income families are the ones falling farthest behind on rents. In many cases, those units are the more affordable units. And vacancy rates on affordable units are traditionally extremely low. It's the most, you know, the tightest end of the market. And so I think it's reasonable to believe that even if those folks were getting evicted, it's likely that those units, the more affordable ones, would be getting quickly turned over. You know, there's always a lot of people out there looking for a good deal, and especially in difficult economic times. So I don't think that there would be like suddenly a large vacancy rate in the affordable market. Next slide. So as we saw in our survey, that the federal stimulus funds, both by way of the $1,200 stimulus check and through the unemployment boost, were critical in helping a lot of families stay current through July. The House of Representatives passed a $3 trillion stimulus round 2, I think, clear back in May, but it really didn't start getting negotiated in the Senate until the end of July. And then, as I mentioned a couple minutes ago, the talks broke down, and I think they are to have reconvened early this month, but if anyone else has heard anything indicating they are nearing agreement, I have not. Next slide. However, a couple of weeks ago, FEMA did authorize an extension of what was formerly the $600 a week boost to state unemployment. It's at half the level of before, so $300 a week, and it does require the recipient to have already qualified to receive at least $100 a week in unemployment benefits through the state. Now, that money is being issued retroactively back to when the last program ended, which was July 26, and was expected, at least here in Minnesota, to provide enough money to extend benefits for an additional 5 weeks, which, if you do the math, ended August 29th. Homeline, if you know anything that contradicts anything I'm saying here, feel free to chime in, but it looks to me that, like, almost as soon as folks were notified that this extra money was on the way, they were past the period that it covered. And to be sure, it's incredibly welcome for folks who are having trouble staying current on their rents. But again, we're into the unknown, though state unemployment benefits will continue on. Next slide. Ordinarily, state unemployment benefits are roughly half your wage, and they last 26 weeks. But the original CARES Act extended that by 13 weeks, which if you filed at the beginning of the pandemic, that would take you kind of through the end of the year. I should not have said through the end of the year on the slide there, because that's I think you're getting the 39 weeks. Again, somebody correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you're getting the 39 weeks regardless of when you file. And next slide, please. Now, there was a period of time in mid-July when we all knew the federal supports were running out. And at that time, the state stepped up with $100 million in emergency rent and mortgage assistance. The COVID Housing Assistance Program started taking applications in mid-August. Funds are being distributed by partner agencies throughout the state. Families are eligible if they're Minnesotans who have past due rent or mortgage, actually, from a bill after March 1 of this year, and if they're below 300% of the poverty level. And that will be around as long as the fund lasts or through the end of the year. So if you know of anyone who might be able to benefit from this program, the simplest way to apply is to find the application right off the home page for United Way 211. Next slide. Okay, other market stuff. I guess next slide. So Eric asked me to say a few words about Section 8 and if we've seen any change in acceptance rate in the past few months. Partially, I think, just to see if landlord disposition has changed in general, but also because the Minnesota Court of Appeals ruled in June that Minneapolis could enforce their ordinance requiring landlords to accept Section 8 vouchers, housing choice vouchers.
Not to be overly lawyerly here, Dan, but it was the Supreme Court, the Minnesota Supreme Court, that ruled that way.
Thank you very much. No, sure. That's good to know. So, and maybe you know this, I don't know how much sort of quote unquote they can enforce translates to, there's that dog that can't stay under control. How they can enforce is sort of similar to how they do enforce. So I don't know, but in reality, we can look at what impact there is in our data and see if there has been a change since that time.
Yeah, I don't think the city is enforcing yet, because there maybe was some open questions that go back to the district court. Isn't that right, Mike?
Right. The case was remanded back, so it's not officially done yet, but kind of the core meat of the argument has been decided. So.
Okay, but there is not necessarily a reason to believe, like for a landlord, it does not at the moment is probably not behaving in a way where they would fear enforcement at this time.
I tell you what, if I were a landlord lawyer, I'm a tenant lawyer, but if I were a landlord lawyer and I were in Minneapolis, I would not be saying in my ads, no Section 8. I think you're just opening yourself up to a potential lawsuit. So.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll mention that for data that we have on Section 8, we only have it for vacancies that were posted to our site, which is only a subset of our overall database, because we require an answer to that question if you're posting a vacancy to our site, whereas data that we get from other publicly available listings, it's not, you dependably get the no, but you don't dependably get the yes, if that makes sense. So it's not something that we can really analyze. But it's fair to say that our data from our website is not representative of the entire market. It's looking only at the affordable end of things, and it's landlords who like to use Housing Link. So next slide. So all that big preface for this graph, but basically we're setting the beginning of the year as a baseline and saying for each consecutive month afterwards, how much are we up or down? And it's clear that there is some kind of upward trending from the beginning of the year. As to whether it's COVID inspired, so everything I was saying near the beginning about a general softening of the market, a higher rate of Section 8 acceptance almost always follows higher vacancy rates. So that might be going on. Although it definitely looks like a spike in Minneapolis. If you think about that ruling in June, and then you just see it spike right up, so 28% higher than it was at the beginning of the year for accepting Section 8. Now, I'll say that of landlords that except we're somewhere around 70% saying yes for landlords that post to our site. So it's getting that percentage is pretty high there in Minneapolis at this time. Something to watch, especially if it is sort of, you know, ultimately finally affirmed through the courts. Next slide, please. Also gonna, sorry, I should have just 2 slides forward. So multifamily apartments, thank you, as a percent of the market. So this is one of the metrics that we're following on our COVID-19 rental housing trends dashboard, that Tableau set of visualizations on our website. We can see that the percent of listings made up of multifamily apartments has gone up from the beginning of the year. And we've never really thought about that as a trend that has any sort of seasonality to it, but I did want to check that out. Next slide. So we did look specifically for Q2, which is the last quarter for which we have data for the entire quarter, but from April to June, and we were up 7% from last year, which is not nothing. So I can't say why we would be seeing a higher percentage of multifamily listings, although I could speculate. A decent percentage of vacancies we pick up, well, a lot of vacancies that we pick up are new units that are going into the marketplace. For multifamily, those can often be because they were newly constructed or rebuilt. In the single family and shadow market, you know, they're not producing, there's not a lot of like building new single family rental units. Generally, when new units enter the market and that end of things, it's because like an individual who owns them has finally decided to rent them out. And we could speculate that, you know, even as I said, that there were a number of units that were in the pipeline in Minneapolis and particularly around downtown that were still hitting the market. On the shadow market end of things with single family duplex and so on, that maybe would-be landlords are a little more reluctant to undertake the process of going into being a landlord during this, you know, very uncertain time. So that could be an effect we're seeing. Next slide. We haven't really used the term today, but if you have interacted in affordable housing circles in the past few years, you've almost certainly encountered the term NOAH, so naturally occurring affordable housing. This refers to housing that is not contractually obligated to affordability, but just happens to be affordable, generally by virtue of some combination of property class, amenities, what pressure there is on rent in the market, and so on. It's been a thing of great concern in recent years, since NOAH housing isn't something that you build. It's something that just kind of happens over time as properties age and markets change. So once a NOAH property goes away or gets bought or repositioned or whatever, it's not coming back. So there is a lot of attention directed at identifying and preserving this housing stock. Next slide. So here we've been tracking 1 to 3 bedroom NOAH vacancies by month so far in 2020. This is also from our COVID-19 rental housing trends Tableau thing on our website. A couple things I'll note here. We define NOAH for this report as affordable to households making 60% of the area median income. I don't think there's an agreed upon standard for what means NOAH throughout the industry, but that's as good as any, because it's sort of the upper range of, in terms of like subsidized affordable, you know, where like tax credits and so on. Housing is kept affordable generally to 60% AMI as sort of an upper cap. So we're looking at private market units that are affordable to 60%. Now we get our 60% of area median income figure from HUD, who publishes new income levels each year. Typically, those will be a higher income level each year. Those are published in April. And again, this year, at the time those were published, they're higher than the previous years. So typically we'll see a little bump. You know, if incomes are a little higher, that means that 60% of median income is a little higher. And so more rents are going to qualify as affordable. So like there you see a little bump, at least in 1 and 2 bedroom units, which is where there's a larger supply of units typically. You're seeing a few more that are considered affordable there, but that it kind of drifted back down, and there as you get to July, it really dipped in all three bedroom sizes. So that's something to note, that may, you know, seeing, even as we're seeing more vacancy and rents, overall median rents down, we're seeing fewer units at the affordable end of things. Checking in on our dashboard later this month, we'll have August numbers, and we can see whether that downward trend continues. Next slide. And that is, I think that's actually all I have prepared for today. This is a screenshot. If you do a drop down of the resources on the research page of our website, so that COVID rental housing trends report I keep referring to is the second link in the drop down. The Minneapolis and St. Paul rental housing briefs, those reports can be accessed right there in that drop down. On the page for Minneapolis and St. Paul rental housing briefs, you can sign up to get new reports sent as they are published each month. Right on this page, which is like the data and research landing page, you can sign up to get new releases if you're that sort of person that wants to hear about when Housing Link puts out new research or has data updated or something. You can sign up and get an email. It's kind of sporadic, but when we have something to announce, it goes out through there. And I would encourage you to go to some of these other resources, just sort of cruise around and see what we have available. And that is all I have for today.
Dan, I got a couple of questions.
Yeah.
Is there any way that you track concessions that landlords offer? You have, one of your stats showed what the application fee was, and you've shown us lots of, you know, what the actual rent is. And I think you even had security deposits listed in one of the slides, but are concessions tracked anywhere?
We track, because the only place where we get enough data to make that possible is through our listings on our website. So it would be only that subset of listings that are affordable and coming through our website. We would have data to see whether application fee, if that's changed, the background checks, the percentage that are requiring certain types of background checks, and security deposit. So that would
But
be
like
something.
first month's rent free, you wouldn't have that.
We do not have that. Those other ones, if they would be of any use, I could pull some numbers and I could get them to you guys, and you could like do a little
Sure.
update.
No, I'm just trying to figure out what the true rent is for folks, because those concessions can be pretty substantial.
Yeah, it's just not something that we have built into our reporting, so it's not something that we have.
And you gave us a ton of facts, a lot of statistics and charts. Is there any, because I mean, you guys have contact with numerous landlords, I assume, and tenants. Is there any sense overall of why? I mean, the theories that you guys are putting forward as to why the rents are going down? I mean, I have a couple, but what's your sense of that?
My sense of that was it's a bit speculative, but I just think that there's been a lot of building going on, and I think, and the especially on the upper end, the sort of the Class A luxury end of things, that there was just a lot of new units built, and it finally kind of got to that point where was a little saturated on
You're
that
talking about the
end.
stuff that we read about in the Star Tribune on an almost monthly basis, where there's a brand new 200-unit luxury building going up in Minneapolis, right?
Yeah, yeah. And it just typically then, if that happens very often, it'll filter down a little to other listings. And as I said, we're a little more responsive to new construction and so on, because those are listings that are necessarily hitting the market. As opposed to if like rents are changing in occupied units and we're not seeing those. But yeah, so like listings that are hitting the market, like new constructed units and so on, are coming in at slightly lower price points than they had been. So to me, that suggests a supply reasoning behind it.
Right, and also mortgage rates are incredibly low right now. So I assume
Yeah.
that there are renters that may have been on the fence about, do I buy a house this year or next year? And they look at the mortgage rates and say, they might not be this low next year. Maybe I should buy a house this year. So I don't know if that's something that is any way to really track, because we don't get a sense of why people leave their rentals yet.
Yeah, that's fair. Although it is interesting, because always, as rents are going up, also that is usually putting a pressure on that shadow market of like the single family homes and so on, where there's been for a number of years recently a lot of pressure for those people to like, well, why am I renting this out? I could sell this for 2 times or 2.5 times what I bought it for, during the last recession. And so there's been units that are leaving rental stock. And also, until recent times, there was a certain number of rental stock units, and especially in that shadow market, that were leaving for short-term rental and sort of the VRBO and so on. And so that was another pressure that sort of is constraining supply a bit. But as I say, I think that just sort of the supply of multifamily in recent times kind of outstripped those other factors a bit.
And how long have you been tracking the type of information you showed us today? How long has Housing Link been tracking that info?
The private market rents, we started publishing Twin Cities Rental Review in the third quarter of 2011.
Okay. So in that time, has there ever been a decrease sort of generally in rental amounts like you've seen in the last 8
I mean, I
months?
think I showed, for at least in terms of 1 to 3 bedroom rents, I was showing in one of the earlier slides, it was looking at those fourth quarters basically since, I think, 2012 to 2019. And there had been one maybe slight dip over that time, but it has been.
So I'm sorry, like a 1 quarter
upward
dip is what you're saying?
Yeah, or just, it was a year over year.
Oh, okay.
But that was just 1 quarter of the year. That's not to say, if you looked at rents throughout the entire year, that was the case. Basically, I would say that there has been a continual, consistent upward pressure on rents since the emergence of from the Great Recession.
Eric, I know that there's some questions that came in. Can you give Dan the ones that are specific to his presentation?
Yeah, there's a couple directed at some of the things that you covered, Dan. And again, thank you for joining us. Thanks for going into detail on this information, and also really appreciate that you looked up and took a look at the Section 8 issue too, as that it's something of interest to us, and I think very topical right now.
Sure.
So somebody did ask, and I think maybe you sort of answered this, but are Housing Link searches only for low income / affordable housing, or all housing?
So we have a cap on rents that can be listed on our website of 100% that needs to be affordable to 100% area median income. For what it's worth, that covers 97% or so of all listings that are out there. So it's really just excludes luxury apartments. And some of that is, we're an affordable housing organization, but we have the limits as high as we do, just because if there's a larger management company that has units in kind of a couple different portfolios, we don't want to tell them, well, we'll only take some of your listings. We want them to be able to give us, like, a listing feed and put as much on there as we can. So we want to make it, as easy as we can for landlords. So you'll find some, a lot of rents that don't necessarily look affordable, but hopefully overall it's providing more options for renters. But I will make that distinction again that, our listings on our website are just a subset of our overall private market. So the stats you're seeing on rents are for like rental trends are not affordable rental trends. They are representative of the overall market. We've tracked pretty closely along with, like, when market analysis or market analysis firms like Market Advisors does their work. They're again working with occupied unit rents, and we're doing rental listings, but we track fairly closely over time.
All right. And somebody asked about, have you happened to see an uptick or any trends in listings that are false or predatory?
This is totally anecdotal, but we're a small enough organization that when an issue like that comes up, it's like, hey, we've been hearing about this, or hey, somebody alerted us to this. It kind of, it makes the rounds where everybody can see it, and we're investigating it and trying to put a stop to it. And I would say anecdotally, I have not been aware that there has been. It's not from a research perspective. That's from a guy that works at a affordable rental listings place.
Sure. Yeah. Better quality control there than sometimes what we see on Craigslist and elsewhere. That sometimes we have clients that are facing those things. Yeah, and feel free. We still have some more time. We're going to pass over to Mike in a minute here to answer some of the questions about the CDC suspension and others. But if there are any other questions for Dan and the research that he's covered, send them in. I'll just note, maybe you saw it in the chat, Hillary did say that Met Council regional solicitation grants for federal transportation funds, they required that it had to include streams as or data from streams as a preferred source for that information on affordable housing. So that might have impacted some of your web data as well.
Thank you, Met Council.
And then somebody in the chat is saying, we've seen a huge increase in fraudulent applications. So that might be coming from a landlord. Has anybody else run into this? I'm not sure. I'm not sure that, there is, maybe Mike can speak to this, but there is, there's a state statute that creates a penalty for tenants lying on an application.
Oh, is that what we think this is about?
I'm not sure if whoever sent it in wants to clarify it.
Yeah, there is a penalty against tenants for lying on an application to try to get rental housing. Sure, it's a $500 penalty. I don't think I've ever seen a landlord sue successfully over it. It's also probably, depending on what the lease is, it might be felony level fraud trying to qualify for housing with a fraudulent application. So the rules they're not new for tenants to apply for a place. The protections that might exist already or the sanctions against them, but they are rarely enforced. The reason why landlords almost never go after a tenant for lying on an application is because they'd have to sue in small claims court against somebody who they might not even know who it is. I mean, if they lied on the application about their identity, it's going to be really difficult to sue them in conciliation court and successfully ever collect the money.
All right. And it sounds like maybe they're clarifying maybe tenants using fake identities and fake proof of payroll. So that would probably fall under that, and there might be other bigger consequences. Yep.
We've also seen fraudulent landlord rentals. I thought that's what this was about first.
Yep.
Where landlords have been trying to, sort of rent the Brooklyn Bridge kind of thing. It's a home that they don't actually own, and they're trying to rent it out. And in this modern era of people renting places sight unseen, we have had some cases where landlords have been renting a place that they had no right to rent, and there's criminal charges filed against the landlord if they can be found. typically out of state, and it takes a few connections to get to them.
I'm going to try to find the statute about the application.
It's in 504B somewhere, and I can
I'll
pull
find
up
it.
the number. It's not one that we cite much, certainly, because not too many tenants sue under it and not too many landlords sue under it. It's 173.
Okay. All right. So yeah, just a few questions that were submitted in advance, and there's one in the queue. Emily said, asked or mentions that she rents a room in her home where she still lives, and she's having to work from home now, and wants to get the tenant out. The tenant has a month-to-month lease. Emily's seen nothing in the law that addresses this situation. Does the fact that I'm renting as a homeowner in my own home, renting my own home out, a unit in my own home out, give me the right to end the lease during the moratorium?
Yeah, so what Emily is, I think, asking about is Executive Order 20-79, which is the Minnesota governor moratorium on evictions in general. And the question that I think really matters for this question is, I don't think that the order gives an exception that Emily wants to have in existence for this answer. I'll tell you what I'm talking about here. Sorry about the delay, but I looked up the actual language of the order once again. There is an exception. So Governor Walz's executive order effectively banning evictions for most reasons that are out there gives an exception for if the landlord or a family member is to move in to the property. That implies that the landlord wasn't already there. And so in Emily's specific situation where I think if I'm reading her question right, she's saying I rent out a room in my home where I still live. So that implies that she's been living there the whole time. And so I don't think that the family member exception would give her the power to force the tenant to go during the governor's executive order exemption.
Right. Mary asks a question, or maybe just is wondering if you can talk a little bit about the situation with the current eviction suspension, and if somebody's feeling like they're experiencing retaliation by the landlord.
Yeah, so if a tenant is feeling like they're being threatened with an eviction or there's retaliation happening, the number one step in most situations is going to be for them to contact the Attorney General's office. They are the sole enforcer of the governor's executive order banning evictions from being filed or carried out in a less court way. And so the AG's office is where I'd start with that kind of question. I mean, we'd be happy to talk to somebody and make sure that it fits for them to talk to the AG's office, but they're free. They remain confidential. If you wish it, they can be contacted either by phone or, as Assistant Attorney General Catherine Kelly last week said, they prefer to have the request done on their online portal where a tenant can say, here's my situation, what can be done to help protect me, not just for the eviction, but potentially with retaliation as well.
All right. Kimberly asked, is there continuing education credits available through the Department of Commerce? I'm guessing that's a question for us about, can you get continuing education credits for viewing our seminar from the Department of Commerce?
I don't know. I don't think we've ever tried to get continuing education credits through the Department of Commerce. We have for a couple of our Wednesday sessions gotten continuing legal education credits through the Lawyers Board, CLE credits as they're called. Typically when we've had guest speakers that were attorneys, we've done that. I think those are the 3 times that we've actually applied for those. But I don't know anything about that. Do you know anything about that, Eric?
I don't, but if there's folks that are on that would find that useful and can direct us on how to do that, if it's a simple process, we might be able to try that, because we did basically get requests from lawyers since many of these sessions have been fairly legally focused.
Right, and somebody might think that today's session would have been especially fitting for a Department of Commerce certification, I imagine. And so maybe we can get that retroactively done if it's not cost prohibitive.
Charlotte asks, does the new CDC moratorium cover non-federally subsidized units?
Right. Something we covered earlier, but I certainly don't mind restating it because it's important and it's confusing, which is frankly one of the reasons why we have these every Wednesday sessions. Yes, the CDC moratorium covers non-federally subsidized places. It's virtually every tenant in the United States is eligible to be covered by the CDC eviction moratorium. I take that back, except in American Samoa. You can tell that I actually read this because it really stands out when you read it. American Samoa has had no reported cases of COVID-19. So any tenants in American Samoa, which is a territory of the United States, is not protected by the CDC moratorium on evictions. Every other tenant in the United States is. There's no requirement that there's a federal subsidy. There's no requirement that it's Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac backed mortgage. Every tenant in the United States is covered by this. Again, if a state or a locality has a higher level of protection for tenants, then that is the rule that is in place, not the CDC order. So you only look to CDC order, which is, if you want to think of it in some sort of sequential way, the state moratorium would be number one. You only get to number two if number one doesn't exist or it has elapsed or has lapsed time-wise.
All right. Those are the ones we got in advance. We have a couple more that have come in, but I also want to just share, thanks to Dan, he just sent the Star Tribune is reporting as of about an hour ago, no, less than an hour ago, 20 minutes ago, that Walz has extended the state's peacetime emergency. So I think what that means is he's initiated the special session for Friday and probably announced his intention to do that. I'm not sure if he's actually signed an executive order on it yet.
Right. Again, what we expected, and we talked about that earlier in the session. Not that we had any inside knowledge. We're just reading the same publicly stated tea leaves that everybody else is. No, we had gathered from reports this week that the governor was going to do that, and it looks like Dan has found that it's official. So. Yeah.
So again, the legislature will have to come back and. If it goes anything like it has the past few times, it will stick. So next question, and might be repetitive a little bit again here, but oh no, this is another new question. So what for the CDC declaration? For the CDC declaration, where do you think that Minnesota's Executive Order 20-79? The specific exemption that allows the termination of a lease if the landlord or the family member of the landlord, property owner, wants to move in. Where does that fall in terms of the additional CDC suspension?
There is some confusion about what the CDC order means when it comes to something called holding over. So could a landlord make a tenant go in a CDC question, let's take it out of Minnesota for a moment. Could a landlord say, hey, your lease is over, I'm not going to renew it. I'm not evicting you for non-payment of rent, I'm evicting you for holding over. It's not especially clear. I mentioned earlier how poorly drafted I thought it was. And I don't think I'm alone in that assessment. I don't think that question is specifically answered from what I've seen, both landlord and tenant groups around the country trying to divine what it all means, whether that is a way for a landlord to be able to file an eviction. In Minnesota, we have the protection in place for tenants and for landlords that want to move in, but it may be true that the CDC order would allow a family member holding over sort of eviction to occur. It's not clear yet.
All right. What are the consequences for renters if they were not honest on their CDC eviction form that they provide to landlords?
I'm not entirely sure because I haven't looked into it. I think it's a penalty of perjury. And this is a federal law that they'd be violating. So one would look to see what the penalties are for perjury at the federal level, I guess. I'm not a criminal lawyer, so this kind of stuff doesn't come up in my line of work very often. It's really explicit what happens to a landlord if they violate the CDC order. It's the $100,000 and up to a year in jail. it's not as specific or clear that that same penalty applies to tenants. This is honestly one of those things that we have heard from landlords for a long time, which is, hey, I think landlord or tenants lie on applications for rental housing, or that they'll lie on this affidavit or statement, I guess it is, under penalty of perjury. And maybe they're right, but actually finding them or catching them to find them might be more difficult. Landlords are a lot easier to find for the Department of Justice because they own property and they don't move around as often. Tenants just do, and you might not know who they actually are if you're a landlord complaining about them.
Question kind of following up from the before about fraud again. To avoid fraud from a prospective tenant, could landlords ask for government ID?
There's no specific law that says that a landlord cannot ask for some type of identification. Asking for specific types of identification can be problematic for landlords from a discrimination standpoint, but yeah, is the short answer. Yeah.
All right. And then, all right, so there's a lengthy one. Sounds like this is a landlord. As time goes by, we have more tenants not paying rent. We have followed the advice to keep in contact with them, asking for payment plans. They're getting tenants saying they'll report us for harassing them by asking for a payment. Also tenants saying they have other bills and so they can't pay us. Does anyone take into consideration how this affects us from having money to pay our bills and maintenance costs, and tenants are now several months behind with no end in sight?
Yep, fair question. It really is. And this is one of several giant questions that we're honestly grappling with societally, I think, at this point. It's not some beat up on the landlords or beat up on the tenants view. It's what do we do to try to minimize the impact and the spread of this virus and not penalize people who lost a job, probably something that wasn't their own fault. But then the corollary of that is that landlords aren't getting paid as well. So a couple things that I'll respond with here. Number one, at the federal level, at the state level, at the city level, we are not seeing any governmental agency say rent isn't due. There's no rent forgiveness. There's no rent cancellation. You will see protests demanding that. You will see demonstrations. And I think there's been an ordinance or two introduced around the country that they tried to essentially make it so rent wasn't due. But that's not what's happening. The governor's order, the CDC order, they both say that rent is due. They aren't forgiving the debt. So the debt is still present. And I mean, look, the government is tossing around some pretty unprecedented powers right now. If they wanted to say no rent is due, maybe it would have been tried by now through some executive order, but they haven't. So the rent remains due. So that's one thing. The next thing is all the subsidies that have been occurring. There's some that payments go directly to the landlord. The tenant never actually touches the money. And so there are some funds being set aside. At the state level, there's been talk of more money potentially coming through. But as most of us know, there are different parties in charge of the Senate and the House, and they can't seem to agree on what number should be made available. At the federal level, it's the same problem exactly, is that we have one party in charge of one chamber and another party in charge of another chamber, and they can't seem to agree on what should be done. So there's money that's coming. The money can be earmarked specifically for essentially landlords to get the money, and the rent is still due. So I know that that's not much solace for a landlord that's not getting paid today, and they have bills that come due as well. But the alternative is it might be true that the government would say we're just going to cancel rent or forgive rent. That hasn't happened to date. And so unless and until it does, a landlord still has a claim to that money.
Yeah, and just a reminder that last week, our webinar, we had a couple guests too, and I'm putting the link for the recording in the chat. Folks from Minnesota Housing who are overseeing the state COVID-19 housing assistance program, I think is what it stands for. And so there's plenty of information there. And again, the way to apply is going to be in the chat as well. But there was plenty of information both from Minnesota Housing and then also from Catherine Kelly at the Attorney General's office talking about their enforcement. There's one last question in the chat, I think, from Kim. To apply for emergency rental assistance, when they say you must be impacted by COVID-19, such as losing a job or having COVID-19, et cetera, would it include someone who is not employed but now cannot find employment due to overall conditions? Would they qualify if not more directly affected by COVID-19?
So what we've been talking about today is a CDC order, a federal order. As we've mentioned a few times, it has no real impact in Minnesota right now because Minnesota has more protection in place for tenants. I don't know if any of the local aid has required such statements to be made by tenants, but if so, then the tenant can certainly put that in there.
The state's CHAP funding does one of the requirements, and I'm trying to bring it up again, is to be unable to make the payments owed because of the public health emergency due to unemployment, illness, or another COVID-19 related issue.
So it's not saying loss of employment, it's saying unemployment.
Right. So I think, and I'm trying to find it, Alyssa and Joel from last week did provide an email that like service providers and folks can contact to answer those types of questions. I'm going to try to find that and put it, but yeah, that's what it says on the thing. All right. Were you going to add anything more? Or?
No, that was what I had. Yeah.
All right. So, yeah, just a reminder again, then up on your screen, we'll continue our webinar series next week. Just a regular session next week, not having a guest speaker.
Well, we'll talk about the fact that the governor looks like they're extending the moratorium. We'll talk about whether the legislature decided to try to intervene and stop that, which of course they have the power to do, but both chambers would have to agree to do that. And sort of an overall assessment, but I expect next week to be almost exclusively question and answer in our time frame.
Yeah, and so the information for that will be sent out with the recording for today to your email after later today or tomorrow. And if you have any other information that you're looking for around COVID-19 related issues, we'll have it up on our website. And with that, we want to thank you. And again, thank Dan Hilton from Housing Link for joining us and going through his very detailed and informative presentation.
Thank you.
All right. Well, thanks, everybody. We will call that a day. Bye.